How Supermax prisons actually work, how crime works insider. The blood was already drying by the time they found him. A corrections officer lay motionless on the concrete floor of a federal penitentiary in the late 1980s, keys scattered beside his hand, radio crushed under his shoulder. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and iron. Alarm screamed too late. The attacker was already gone, melted back into a population that knew how to disappear inside walls. It wasn't the first murder. It wouldn't be the last. And for the people tasked with running America's most dangerous prisons, it was the breaking point. Behind closed doors in Washington, officials reached a conclusion that would reshape incarceration forever. Some inmates could not be managed, negotiated with, or contained using traditional prisons. The system needed something colder, quieter, absolute. What followed was not a reform. It was an escalation. Years later, in the high desert of Colorado, the land looks empty enough to forgive anything built on it. Endless sky. Dry wind. Mountains standing guard in the distance. No cities. No distractions. No witnesses. This is where the federal government planted its answer. ADX Florence sits low and wide against the earth, its concrete blending into the landscape like it's trying not to be seen. There are no towering walls meant to intimidate. No dramatic silhouettes. The threat here isn't visual. It's procedural. This is the prison designed for the inmates other prisons failed. And it was born out of blood. In the 1980s, the U.S. prison system was unraveling from within. Gang violence surged. Radicalized inmates coordinated attacks. Guards were targeted. Hostage situations became disturbingly routine. Some inmates treated maximum security prisons like arenas, testing boundaries, studying response times, turning institutional predictability into a weapon. Every reform created a workaround. Every concession became leverage. And when federal officers started dying inside facilities designed to keep everyone safe, the conversation changed. The question was no longer how do we rehabilitate? It was how do we stop this from ever happening again? ADX Florence was the answer no one wanted to say out loud. A prison where inmates would live alone, eat alone, exercise alone, speak to no one. A place where movement itself would be controlled down to seconds and inches. Where human contact would be measured, monitored, and minimized. Not as punishment, as prevention. On paper, it was elegant. Remove the variables. Isolate the threats. Break the networks that made violence possible. But paper doesn't feel pressure. Concrete does. The first inmates transferred to ADX Florence arrived in silence. No crowds. No announcements. Just buses pulling into a secured sally port and doors opening into something that didn't feel like a prison so much as a bunker. Each man was escorted alone. Each cell was identical. 7 by 12 feet. Solid concrete. A bed poured from the floor. A desk molded into the wall. A slit of glass too narrow to look through properly. A toilet and sink fused into steel. Even the window was designed to deny orientation. Positioned so inmates could see sky, but not land. You could tell if it was day. You could never tell where you were. That was intentional. Supermax prisons aren't built to respond to violence. They're built to assume it. Every inch of ADX Florence reflects that assumption. Doors don't slam, they seal. Corridors don't echo, they swallow sound. Cameras don't just watch, they anticipate. Movement schedules are staggered so no two inmates ever cross paths. If traditional prisons manage people, Supermax prisons manage risk. And risk, here, is treated like a contagious disease. But even in a place designed for total control, the story didn't unfold the way planners expected. Because the inmates sent to ADX Florence weren't impulsive criminals. They were organizers, strategists, people who had already learned how systems fail, and how to exploit those failures. Isolation didn't erase that knowledge. It sharpened it. In the early years, staff believed the design was working. Assaults dropped to near zero. Communication between inmates collapsed. Gangs lost cohesion. The metrics looked clean. But beneath the silence, something else was happening. Men who had once controlled entire cell blocks now had nothing but time. Time to observe. Time to think. Time to turn inward, and outward, in ways no one had planned for. Psychologists began to notice changes that weren't in the manuals. Inmates who stopped speaking. Others who spoke to walls. Some who deteriorated rapidly. Others who adapted disturbingly well. The prison had solved violence. But it had created a new question. At what cost? ADX Florence didn't just change inmate behavior. It changed power. Traditional prisons rely on a balance, authority tempered by interaction. In Supermax, authority is absolute, but interaction disappears. Decisions are enforced mechanically. Appeals take months. Human discretion shrinks. For some inmates, that erases leverage. For others, it redirects it. If you can't influence people, you influence policy. If you can't coordinate actions, you coordinate narratives. Legal filings increase. Complaints multiply. Every procedural error becomes a battleground. The war moves from fists to paper. Inside the facility, staff felt it too. Working at ADX Florence meant accepting a paradox. You were safer from physical harm than almost anywhere else in corrections. But the psychological pressure was relentless. Silence stretched shifts into something heavier. Every interaction was transactional. Every mistake carried consequences because there was no room to recover. Officers learned to speak less. To move precisely. To never assume calm meant compliance. Because in a place built to eliminate chaos, even small disruptions mattered. Then came the lawsuits. Former inmates described conditions as unbearable. Isolation as destructive. Time as weaponized. Human rights organizations took interest. Courts began asking questions the architects of Supermax prisons had hoped wouldn't need answering. Was this security? Or something else? The federal government defended ADX Florence as necessary. As rare. As reserved for the worst of the worst. They argued that the alternative, allowing inmates to kill again inside prison walls, was unacceptable. They weren't wrong. But they weren't finished either. Because the real test of a system isn't whether it works once. It's whether it holds under pressure. And pressure was building. As more high-profile inmates were transferred to ADX Florence, the prison's reputation grew. Terrorists. Cartel leaders. Organized crime figures. Men whose names carried weight far beyond concrete walls. The outside world watched closely. And so did the people inside. They were learning the same thing administrators were beginning to realize. Total control doesn't end conflict. It transforms it. Late one night, during a routine systems check, a technician flagged an anomaly. Nothing dramatic. A sensor logging a delay that shouldn't exist. A timing discrepancy so small it would have gone unnoticed anywhere else. But ADX Florence was built on precision. And precision doesn't tolerate anomalies. When engineers traced the issue, they found no damage. No tampering. No obvious cause. Just proof that something inside the system wasn't behaving exactly as designed. That discovery never made the news. But it changed everything. Because if the most secure prison on Earth could be studied, measured, and subtly tested, then the story of how Supermax prisons actually work was far from finished. And what they found next would force officials to confront a truth they weren't ready to admit. Control had limits. Even here, the anomaly wasn't fixed right away. That was the first mistake. In any other prison, a millisecond delay in a sensor log would have been shrugged off as a software hiccup. At a Supermax, nothing exists in isolation. Every system overlaps with another. Every delay creates a shadow, and shadows are where intent hides. Engineers ran diagnostics. Everything passed. Administrators signed off. Life inside the prison continued exactly as designed, which meant nothing continued naturally. Because nothing here ever does. Inside their cells, the men noticed before anyone else. They always do. Supermax inmates live by observation. With no human interaction to fill the hours, patterns become language. The hum of ventilation. The rhythm of lights dimming. The delay between footsteps and the click of a door. These details become clocks. And clocks can be tested. In the weeks after the anomaly first appeared, inmates began filing grievances that, on the surface, seemed unrelated. Complaints about meal temperature, about light intensity, about noise during overnight hours. Each grievance forced staff to log responses, to cross-check systems, to confirm procedures. It looked like noise. It wasn't. It was mapping. Supermax prisons don't rely on force. They rely on certainty. Every inmate knows exactly what will happen next, because unpredictability is risk. Remove uncertainty, and violence has nowhere to grow. That philosophy worked, until someone realized certainty itself could be exploited. By mid-year, staff noticed something unsettling. Inmates were requesting reviews of procedures they shouldn't have known about. References to internal policy language appeared in complaints. Some filings quoted phrasing from staff manuals that weren't publicly accessible. The information wasn't stolen. It had been inferred. Time, isolation, and repetition had turned the prison into a textbook. A task force quietly formed. Not to investigate a crime, but to study behavior. Analysts compared inmate filings, timelines, and housing assignments. What they found was deeply uncomfortable. The most isolated inmates, the ones believed to be the least capable of coordination, were shaping the system's workload. Their complaints forced reviews. Reviews forced audits. Audits diverted staff time. The prison was still secure, but it was being steered. Administrators faced a dilemma no training covered. Responding aggressively would validate the tactic. Ignoring the behavior risked procedural erosion. Every response had to be perfect, because perfection was the only thing Supermax prisons promise. And perfection is fragile. Staff began rotating responses, delaying some acknowledgments, fast-tracking others, introducing small variations to break predictability. It helped, briefly. Then the first transfer request hit a desk it wasn't supposed to reach. An inmate petitioned for reassignment, not to a lower security facility, but to a different Supermax unit. The justification cited environmental factors, psychological strain, and procedural inconsistencies. It was legally airtight. The language mirrored previous court rulings. Someone inside knew how to speak to the system in its own voice. The request was denied. 2 weeks later, 3 similar petitions appeared, from inmates housed in separate wings who had never met. That was no longer coincidence. The war inside the prison had shifted entirely. There were no fights, no threats, no weapons, only pressure, legal pressure, administrative pressure, psychological pressure. The prison responded with policy updates, narrower privileges, tighter reviews, more oversight. Each response fed the machine. Isolation had not broken the most dangerous inmates. It had given them time to evolve. Meanwhile, the mental toll became impossible to ignore. Medical staff documented rising cases of sensory deprivation effects, hallucinations, cognitive slowing, emotional flattening. Some inmates deteriorated quickly. Others adapted in ways clinicians found more disturbing. The most stable inmates were often the most dangerous. They weren't angry. They were focused. Behind closed doors, officials revisited the question they thought they had already answered. Was Supermax confinement a solution, or a holding pattern? The original goal had been simple: stop violence inside prisons. That goal had been achieved. But a new risk had emerged, one harder to quantify and impossible to right control. Influence without contact. Control without force. A system being pressured from within by people who no longer needed to touch each other to work together. Then the second anomaly appeared. Not in a censor. In scheduling. A pattern of coincidental overlaps. Maintenance windows aligning with grievance deadlines, staff rotations matching filing spikes. No single event broke protocol. Together, they formed an efficiency drain no one could pin down. The prison wasn't under attack. It was under study. At a late-night briefing, a senior official said the quiet part out loud. "We built this place to eliminate unpredictability," he said. "And that's exactly what they're using against us." Silence fell. Because that meant the problem wasn't a flaw. It was the design. Plans were drafted to adjust conditions, introduce controlled social contact, restructure isolation timelines, reintroduce limited human interaction to disrupt cognitive loops. Every proposal faced resistance. Supermax prisons were politically untouchable. They existed because fear demanded them. But fear doesn't adapt. People do. As debates stalled, one final development forced the issue. An inmate who had spent over a decade in near total isolation submitted a handwritten letter. Not a grievance, not a petition, not a threat. A letter. It contained no demands. Just a single sentence. You built a place where nothing changes. So we became the only variable. The letter reached the highest levels of federal oversight. And for the first time since the prison opened, the question shifted from can we control them? To something far more dangerous. What happens if control isn't enough? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The letter wasn't a threat, but it landed like one. You built a place where nothing changes. So we became the only variable. For years, the promise of Supermax prisons had been certainty. Predictable movement. Predictable outcomes. A system so tightly engineered that violence had nowhere to live. Now, that promise was cracking, not because of chaos, but because of adaptation. The men inside had not broken the rules. They had mastered them. Federal oversight committees convened behind closed doors. Psychologists, wardens, engineers, and attorneys filled rooms with charts and careful language. No one wanted to say what everyone was thinking. The most secure prison ever built was working exactly as designed, and that design was creating consequences no one had planned for. Isolation had neutralized physical violence, but it had also created thinkers with nothing but time, structure, and repetition. Time to observe, structure to decode, repetition to test. Supermax prisons had removed human interaction, believing it was the source of danger. What they had underestimated was cognition under constraint. Deprived of distraction, the mind doesn't go quiet. It reorganizes. Some minds fractured. Others sharpened. Data began to tell the story officials could no longer ignore. Inmates held in long-term isolation showed two diverging trajectories. One group deteriorated, withdrawal, hallucinations, cognitive collapse. The other stabilized into something colder and more disciplined. These inmates filed fewer emotional complaints and more procedural ones. Their language mirrored policy. Their timing exploited administrative cycles. They weren't rebelling. They were negotiating with a system that didn't believe negotiation was possible. The prison responded with reforms so small they could be denied if challenged. Lights adjusted. Noise protocols tweaked. Schedules randomized. But randomness inside a Supermax is a delicate illusion. Too much unpredictability creates risk. Too little restores patterns. Each adjustment was measured, logged, reviewed. And each was noticed. The grievances slowed. The petitions stopped. For the first time in years, the prison went quiet again. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. 6 months later, a federal judge requested a review of Supermax confinement practices in an unrelated case. The request cited patterns, not incidents. Trends, not events. The language mirrored arguments that had originated, quietly, inside the prison itself. Someone had translated internal pressure into external scrutiny. No leaks were found. No communications intercepted. No violations identified. The system had spoken its own vulnerabilities into existence. Behind the scenes, officials faced a decision they had postponed since the prison's founding. Either Supermax prisons remained static, accepting the long-term psychological cost and legal risk, or they evolved, introducing controlled human interaction to break the cognitive loops isolation had created. Both options carried danger. Change threatened security. Stasis threatened legitimacy. For the first time, the prison was no longer just containing risk. It was becoming one. A pilot program was approved quietly, not announced, not advertised, not acknowledged publicly. A small group of inmates, carefully selected, heavily monitored, were given minimal social contact. Brief interactions. Controlled communication. Human unpredictability reintroduced like a variable in a closed equation. The result was immediate and unsettling. Some inmates regressed. Others lashed out verbally. A few showed relief so visible it alarmed staff. And a handful, those same disciplined, patient men, lost interest. Their filings stopped entirely. The pressure evaporated. That was the most disturbing outcome of all. Because it meant the strategy had worked. The conflict hadn't ended because of force or fear. It ended because the system changed. Which meant the inmates had been right. Total control had limits. Internally, the prison reframed its mission. Not elimination of risk, but management of adaptation. Isolation would remain. But not indefinitely. Not absolutely. ADX Florence didn't close. It didn't soften. But it adjusted. Quietly. Carefully. And without ever admitting why. Years later, public interest in Supermax prisons surged again. Journalists asked how they worked. Documentaries dissected their design. Experts debated their ethics. The prison became a symbol, either of necessary brutality or controlled restraint, depending on who told the story. What rarely made it into those discussions was the truth known only to those inside the system. Supermax prisons don't end violence. They postpone it. They redirect it. They transform it. The most dangerous inmates in America still live behind concrete poured to deny them everything but air and time. They still wake alone, eat alone, exercise alone. Their days are still measured in routines designed to prevent them from touching another human being. But the institution no longer believes that silence equals safety. Because silence, left long enough, learns how to speak. A retired administrator once described the lesson this way. We built a prison to control people. What we learned is that systems are easier to control than minds. The building still stands. The doors still seal. The cameras still watch. But the illusion is gone. Absolute control was never real. It was just uncontested. And if you think the story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it.